So there's a rumour going around that Sony is gearing up to shut down several of its legacy online stores this summer. According to a report from The Gamer, the PlayStation 3 and PSP online stores will close on July 2nd, while the PlayStation Vita store will remain open until August 27th. At present, this rumour is unconfirmed, and I would recommend taking it with a pinch of salt. But then I would say that being notoriously salty myself. Nevertheless, this rumour has kicked off a new wave of discussion online about game preservation and access to retro games. As digital sales continue to grow in popularity over traditional disc or cartridge-based physical media, retro gamers stand to lose out when online storefronts become obsolete. One quote in particular has risen to the forefront of the discussion. In 2017, Sony Interactive Entertainment's president and CEO Jim Ryan was asked about why the PlayStation 4 doesn't support backwards compatibility. His answer is somewhat interesting, to say the least. He said, "When we've dabbled with backwards compatibility, I can say it is one of those features that is much requested but not actually used much." Commenters have been quick to point out that the games industry as a whole is built on nostalgia and constantly re-releasing older games, so it's hard to understand how Ryan could have come to this conclusion. I feel like dabbled is the right word to describe Sony's approach to backwards compatibility, though. It's a feature that is there when it suits them and notably absent when it doesn't. Last year, the PlayStation 5 launched, and surprise surprise, it did so with backwards compatibility for the vast majority of PlayStation 4 games, with many even receiving a free graphical upgrade. Ryan was again asked about further backwards compatibility. Why couldn't the PS5 also handle PS1, PS2 or PS3 games? He answered, and bear in mind that this has been retranslated from Japanese, so it doesn't make a lot of sense, but "We keep in mind the engineering specialised for the PS5 as we produced the device. In the midst of that, the PS4 already has 100 million players. We thought they ought to want to play PS4 titles on the PS5 as well indeed, so we included compatibility with the PS4. While implementing that, we also focused our efforts on taking in the high-speed SSD and the new controller DualSense at the same time. So unfortunately, we couldn't reach the implementation of such compatibilities." It does sound, if I can understand that perhaps mistranslated quote, as if Sony's reluctance to give players full backwards compatibility isn't so much about a lack of interest, but a lack of financial incentive for the company. Sony wants to keep up the momentum of the PlayStation 4, encouraging console owners to upgrade to the latest system, so backwards compatibility makes this $400 or $500 leap a little easier to swallow. Meanwhile, stubborn retro gamers like myself who refuse to part with our old games are in the minority. Sony doesn't expect me to buy a PlayStation 5 just so that I can dig out a dusty, scratched copy of Croc Legend of the Gobbos and see how well it runs on new hardware. In the same 2017 interview in which he claimed that players don't actually want backwards compatibility, he also argued that retro gamers don't exist. He said, "I was at a Gran Turismo event recently where they had PS1, PS2, PS3 and PS4 games, and the PS1 and PS2 games, they looked ancient. Like, why would anybody play this?" Now this is an absolutely fascinating quote, not least because someone at Sony must think that people want to play older games. The following year, the company released the PlayStation Classic, a tiny nostalgia bait emulator console, which plays 20 of the most popular games from the original PlayStation, although it is notable that the original Gran Turismo was absent from the console's lineup. Yet in keeping with their approach of dabbling with retro games, Sony doesn't seem to have fully committed to the PlayStation Classic. The reviews all said the same thing: the games are great, the console is not. The emulation quality is poor enough to make actually playing the device frustrating. The ambitiously priced PlayStation Classic quickly fell into the bargain bins, as stores found that they simply weren't selling as Sony had hoped. I can't help but feel like Sony has created a self-fulfilling prophecy when it comes to these older games. The higher-ups think that nobody wants to play them, so they don't release them. Or when they do release them, they don't give the projects the time and attention they need. Then people don't play them. And Jim Ryan feels justified in assuming that nobody wants to play all these retro games. At least, that's one reading of the situation. A more cynical approach would be to suggest that Sony is making its back catalogue more difficult for consumers to access because it helps to sell their modern remasters. After all, the most significant exclusive launch title for the PS5 that didn't also release on the PS4 is the newly revamped Demon's Souls, a game which was previously only available on PS3. While Demon's Souls won a dedicated fanbase at the time of its initial release, it didn't gain more widespread notoriety until Dark Souls released on the PlayStation 4. But because the PlayStation 4 isn't backwards compatible, a lot of people simply didn't have a way to play the game until the PS5 came along. And even then, only if they can actually get hold of the new console, but I digress. And that's fine for Demon's Souls and for Crash Bandicoot and Spyro and The Last of Us, and on other platforms Pikmin 3, Super Mario World, Skyrim, etc, etc. These big popular games get re-released eventually. We even finally got Scott Pilgrim back. but preserving the little games, the ones that won't sell a million copies upon their re-release, is harder, especially as online stores grow old and become obsolete over time. I'm not saying that these stores should remain online indefinitely. I appreciate that platform holders do see a return on their investment reduce over time. I'm just saying that losing access to these games is a bad thing, and I hope everyone can at least agree with me on that. Of course, where companies like Sony drop the ball in providing long-term access to games, there will always be plenty of people willing to take up the mantle in their stead. Remember how the PlayStation Classic ended up in clearance sales around the world? Well, if you try to buy one now, you'll find them trading hands at around their rather steep original retail price. At least in the UK, I can't comment on the rest of the world, because while the console itself in its original form proved to be a bit of a dud, it was quickly embraced by the hacking and modding community as a bit of a fixer-upper. Now, I'm not an expert on what went down, but as I understand it, dedicated hobbyists found a way to better optimize the system, add in missing games, or games that they considered to be missing from the iconic lineup, and get the device to run RetroArch so that it can be used to emulate a variety of different titles, beyond just PlayStation games. Now, the PlayStation Classic is highly sought after, not for its factory default settings, but for what the homebrew community has turned it into. This isn't the first time that a PlayStation console has been improved in this way. The entire lifespan of the PSP was underpinned by a technological arms race between hackers and Sony. The handheld wasn't particularly secure at launch, and hackers quickly found a way that they could use it to emulate older games, or simply pirate current PSP titles. Every time Sony locked down a security hole with a new update, hackers would find a way to bypass it. They added features like a web browser long before Sony officially added one to the device. Now, I'm not promoting piracy here, because obviously piracy is illegal. But it's worth noting that when a games company restricts access to its storefront, there will always be people who are willing to, shall we say, circulate them through less official channels. So if it turns out that Sony does genuinely pull the plug on the PS3, PSP and PS Vita stores, that's going to be a real loss to the gaming community as a whole. Even as it is now, many of these games are hidden so that they can't be accessed through a web browser without some fiddling, and that's unfortunate. But if Sony really doesn't want to provide access to older digital games, whether because they genuinely don't think people want them or because they're trying to sell the next big thing and they see retro titles as their competition, well, if the games aren't available from Sony, then for good or ill, there will always be people willing to distribute them through less legitimate channels. Anyway, for DualShockers, I have been the Salty Brit. Thanks for watching, and be sure to leave a comment telling me how wrong I am. Bye.